Just confess and we'll drop it." That was my mother, at Thanksgiving, in front of a uniformed officer she had led into her own dining room to arrest her daughter. Me, the daughter who brought the pie. My sister had already given her statement. I'd cleaned out our father's safe, sometime that week, somehow. Chelsea couldn't say what was in it or how much was gone, and nobody asked her to. Then Dad reached over and handed the officer my spare key without being asked for it. A man producing evidence he'd apparently already decided he'd need. I'm 30. I have never taken $1 from that house, and I sat there in my coat and said nothing, because there is no sentence that wins a room where everyone has already agreed on you. I only had one question, and it wasn't for them. Before I ask it, do me a favor. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are, because I want to know who's awake for this. And if you've ever been the one person in your family who gets handed the blame like it's a plate at dinner, hit subscribe, because you already know how this feels, and I'd rather not be alone in it. My name is Simone Thatcher. I was 30 years old that November. I live about 25 minutes from the house I grew up in, and I do a very boring job. I'm a mortgage underwriter. My entire profession is reading a stranger's financial life and deciding whether the paper matches the person. Dates, amounts, signatures, timestamps. I look at documents all day and I ask one question over and over, the same question, thousands of times a year. Does this line up? I want you to hold on to that because it's going to matter more than anything else I tell you. And I want you to understand what I did not know when I sat down at that table. I did not know what was in the safe. I did not know what my mother had been doing with the mail. I did not know that 3 weeks later, I'd be standing in a bank conference room with 3 sheets of paper and one question for an uncle I hadn't spoken to since a funeral. I only knew that my paycheck had been wrong since August and that nobody could tell me why. Let me take you back to the table. The dining room at 1400 Ashgrove Lane has not changed since 2004. Same runner down the middle. Same chipped gravy boat that only comes out twice a year. My mother, Diane, 61, sat where she always sits, at the end, with her back to the window, because that's the seat where the light hits everyone's face except hers. My father, Wayne, 63, sat to her left, quiet, the way he has been quiet through every important moment of my life. My sister Chelsea, 34, sat across from me with her husband Trevor beside her. Their 3 kids were downstairs with a movie on. There was a 14-pound turkey and a bowl of green beans and a pie I had made at 11 the night before because I'd worked late. At 3:15, a police officer knocked on the front door, and my mother went and let him in like he was expected. He wasn't the loud kind. Officer Novak. 30-something, tired, notebook. The flat courtesy of a man who has walked into 100 family dinners and knows that 9 out of 10 are nothing. He stood at the end of the table with his hat in his hand and said he'd received a report of a theft at this address. And Chelsea said, "She emptied Dad's safe." Not I think. Not we're not sure. She said it the way you say something you've been saying inside your own head for a week until it wears a groove. Nowak asked when. Chelsea said sometime that week. He asked what was taken. Chelsea said cash. He asked how much. There was a pause. And into that pause, my father reached across the table and put my spare key down in front of the officer and slid it, with 2 fingers, the way you'd slide a check across a desk. Nowak looked at the key. He did not pick it up. My mother folded her hands. She has beautiful hands. And she used the voice she used when I was 7 and had a fever, the one that sounds like a blanket. And she said, "Simone, just confess and we'll drop it. Nobody wants this." And here's the thing I need you to understand about that sentence, because I didn't understand it for another 11 days. She wasn't offering me mercy. She was offering the officer a reason to leave. I didn't argue. I want to be honest about that. I didn't stand up and say, "How dare you?" I sat in my coat with my hands flat on the table, and I let it happen, because I have been in that room my whole life and I know the physics of it. Every word I say gets picked up by 3 people, turned over, and handed back to me as evidence of something. My mother is very good at that. My sister has never had to be good at it because she's never needed to be. But Novak was still standing there, and Novak wasn't family. And that was the first time in my entire life that the room contained someone who had no idea what part I was supposed to play. So I asked my one question. I said, "Officer, the safe keeps a log." He looked up. I said, "It's an electronic lock. Every code that opens it gets recorded. Date, time, which code. It records the failed tries too. I can pull it up right now." I remember the exact quality of the silence. It wasn't shock. Shock is loud. It was more like the sound a room makes when 4 people simultaneously decide not to move. Novak said, "You can pull it up." I said, "I bought that safe. I installed it. The account's under my email." He said, "Who has codes?" And I answered him without thinking, because it was a boring question with a boring answer. And I was still, at that moment, a woman defending herself against a stupid accusation about cash. I said, "Dad's is user 1, Chelsea's is user 2, Mom's is 3, mine's 4. I want to describe what happened to my mother's face when I said Chelsea's is user 2, because I saw it and I cataloged it, and I did not understand it for another 2 weeks. It didn't go pale. It went still. Every muscle in it stopped at once, like a video buffering. And then it came back on, smooth, warm, and she said, "Sweetheart, nobody needs a computer to know what happened here." I unlocked my phone, opened the app, and held it out. Noak took it. And then he did something I didn't expect. He walked out of the room with it. He went out to the front porch and pulled the door most of the way shut behind him. And I sat at that table with my family and a cooling turkey, and I could see him through the sidelight, a blue shape, not moving. Chelsea got up and started clearing plates that nobody had finished. Noak was on that porch for about 4 minutes. I counted, because there was nothing else to do. When he came back in, he didn't sit down and he didn't hand me my phone. He stood at the end of the table and he read. I watched him read 4 lines. I know it was 4 because I watched his eyes go down and stop 4 times. Then he stood up straighter. That's the part I'll never get out of my head. He was already standing and he got taller anyway, and he turned his whole body away from me and looked at my parents, not at Chelsea, at my parents. And he said, "Ma'am, this isn't about the money." My mother said, "That's enough." Not "what do you mean?" Not "what are you talking about?" She said that's enough the way you say it to a child who's found the wrong drawer. Noak said, "Ms. Thatcher, would you step outside with me?" And I stood up and I started to reach for my phone, and my mother put her hand on my wrist. Not hard. She's never once in my life had to do anything hard. She just put her hand there and said, "Sit down, Simone." And I felt myself start to sit down, 30 years old, in my own coat. Noak said, "Ma'am, don't touch her." I have thought about that sentence more than anything else anyone said in that house. A stranger had been there for 6 minutes, and he was the first person in 30 years to tell my mother to take her hand off me. The porch was cold and smelled like other people's fireplaces. Novak had my phone face down against his thigh. He said, "How long since you last opened that safe?" I said, 2019, the day I installed it." He said, 6 years. I said, "Yeah." He wrote something. Then he said, "Does anyone in that house have your social security number?" And I laughed. I actually laughed out loud on my parents' porch because it was the dumbest question I'd ever been asked. I said, they're my parents. They've had it since I was born." And Officer Novak did not laugh. He looked at me for about 2 seconds too long, and then he looked back at his notebook, and he wrote for a while. I said, "What did the log say?" He said, "I'm not going to tell you that." I said, "It's my account." He said, "It's an attachment to a report now." He handed my phone back, screen down, and he closed his hand over mine for a second so I'd stop and listen. He said, "Don't open that app again. Don't scroll it. Don't screenshot it. Don't send it to anybody. Right now that log is worth something because you handed it to me before you looked at it. The second you start going through it, somebody gets to stand up in a room and say you had 6 weeks alone with the evidence. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" I did. That's the terrible part. I understood him professionally, immediately, the way you understand your own language. I spend my life explaining to people why a document they altered with good intentions is now worthless. I said, "So how do I ever see it?" He said, "You request the report, Records Division. There's a form and a fee, and it takes about 2 weeks. 2 weeks. I had just handed the single most important object of my life to a stranger and been told to come back in 2 weeks like it was a dry cleaner. He gave me a card with a report number on it. Then he said the last thing, and he said it while looking at the front door, not at me. He said, "Pull your credit report, not the free score app, the full file, all 3. I said, "Why?" He said, "Because I've been doing this 11 years, and I'd like to be wrong." Then he got in his car and left, and I stood on the porch of the house I grew up in and realized I did not have my coat. I had to go back in for it. The room had reorganized itself the way a wound closes. They were eating pie. My pie. My father was serving it. My mother was telling Uncle Dale on speakerphone that everything was fine, just a misunderstanding, honey, and Chelsea was standing at the sink with the water running and her back to the door, and she did not turn around, not once, not when I came in, not when I got my coat off the chair, not when Trevor said my name. Trevor walked me out. He's not a bad man. He's just a man who married into this and got told the rules on day one and decided the rules were the weather. At my car, he stood there with his hands in his pockets and he said, "Simone, I'm sorry." I said, "For which part?" And he looked at the house and he said something he did not mean to say. He said, "She was up all night last week." I said, "Who was?" And he said, "Chelsea, all week. She hasn't been sleeping." And then he heard himself and his face did a small, terrible thing and he said, "Drive safe," and went back inside. I sat in my car in the driveway with the engine off for a long time. Here's what I want you to sit with because I sat with it for 11 days. Somebody accused me of a crime that had no amount. Somebody had a key ready before the police arrived. And a man who reads police reports for a living looked at 4 lines of machine text and stopped caring about the money entirely. 4 lines. That was it. 4 lines of a log I'd installed myself, in a safe I'd bought myself, in a house where I hadn't slept in 12 years. I'm going to tell you what those 4 lines said. But I couldn't tell you then, and I want you to feel what that was like because for the next 2 weeks, the most important sentence in my life was sitting in a filing cabinet at a police station, and I was not allowed to read it. On the drive home, I kept thinking about a Christmas. December 2019. There'd been a run of garage break-ins on Ash Grove, 3 houses in a month, nothing big, tools and a snowblower. And my father kept everything in a shoebox, not a metaphor, an actual Reebok box on the shelf in his closet with the birth certificates and the titles and the social security cards. And every year my mother said, "Wayne, that shoebox." And every year nothing happened. So I bought him a safe. I was 24 and I made $38,000 a year, and it cost me $600 I did not have. And I hauled it up their front steps myself and bolted it to the floor of his closet myself. And I set up the app because my father does not do phones. And my mother stood in the doorway and dictated the codes. She said, "Your father's is one." "Fine." She said, "Give Chelsea 2." I said, "Chelsea?" And my mother said, "She's closer, Simone. If something happens, she's 12 minutes away." Which was true, which was always true about everything. She said, "Mine's 3. And I sat on my father's closet floor with my thumb on the keypad and I said, "What about mine?" And my mother said, "You won't need one." I made myself user 4 anyway. I remember doing it fast like I was stealing something. Then I stood up and gave my father the spare override key, and he said, "You hold it, you'll lose it," which was the closest my father has ever come to saying he trusted me. That's the whole flashback. That's it. A woman in a doorway assigning her children numbers. When I got home that night, I sat at my kitchen counter, and I opened the Safe app and looked at the icon, and I did not press it. I put the phone face down and slid it away from me across the counter like it was hot. And then I did the only thing I know how to do when I'm frightened. I opened a spreadsheet. I made 1 column, and I typed a header across the top, and the header said, "Things I mailed." I have been mailing things certified since I was 24. It's the only religion my job ever gave me. You send the letter, you pay the extra $8, and a stranger signs a card, and that card comes back to you with a date on it, and now the thing you claim is a thing you can prove. In my industry, we have a saying, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. Most people think that's cynical. It's the kindest sentence I know. It means the truth doesn't have to shout. So that's what I had at 11 at night on Thanksgiving, a spreadsheet with 1 column and nothing in it. But it didn't start at Thanksgiving. I need to back up to August because by the time that officer walked into my mother's dining room, I'd already been fighting something for 4 months without knowing what it was. The first week of August, my paycheck was short $430. I want to be precise about how boring this was. I don't look at the deposit. Nobody looks at the deposit. I noticed because a card got declined at a grocery store for $11 and change, and I stood in the checkout line at 7 in the evening with my face going hot while a teenager waited, and I said, "Try it again," and it declined again, and I put back a rotisserie chicken. That's how this started, not with a lawsuit, with a chicken. I went home and opened my pay stub, and there was a line on it I had never seen on my own stub in my life. Other deductions, $430. Found. I work at Halverson Home Lending. There are about 400 of us. I emailed payroll that night and got an auto reply. I emailed again Monday. On Wednesday, a woman named Denise wrote back with one sentence. "We're required to comply with the court order." I read that sentence maybe 30 times. Court order. I have never been to court in my life. I've never had a parking ticket go to collections. And here is the thing people find hardest to believe about me. I had never once looked at my own credit file. Not the score, not the app, nothing. In 8 years, I'd read 500,000 lines of other people's financial lives and never one line of my own. And that wasn't laziness. It was the opposite. It was a rule. I'll tell you where the rule came from in a minute, and when I do, you're going to want to put your hand through a wall because it was the only rule I never broke, and it was the exact rule that kept the lights off for 19 years. I called payroll and asked for a copy of the order. She said she'd request it from HR. That was August 12th. It took until November 3rd. 83 days. And I want you to understand, that wasn't a conspiracy. Nobody at my company was hiding anything. It was worse than that. It was a woman on maternity leave and a shared inbox and a record system that got migrated in September, and 3 emails from me that were polite because I was embarrassed. Because deep down, I assumed it was my fault. That's what 30 years in my family does to you. Something goes wrong, and your first move is to check whether you deserved it. Meanwhile, every 2 weeks, $430. By October, it was $2,580 I didn't have. I dropped my gym, I stopped buying lunch, I moved my car insurance to a worse policy, and I told nobody, because who would I tell? My mother? My mother's response to any problem I have ever had is to explain, gently at length, why Chelsea's version of that same problem is harder. Which brings me to a sentence I should probably say out loud. I grew up with a sentence. My mother has said it about me, to other people, in front of me, my entire life, and she says it like a compliment. She says, "Oh, Simone doesn't need anything." Church potluck. Simone doesn't need anything. Parent-teacher conference. Simone doesn't need anything. Chelsea's wedding, when there was 1 dress budget and 2 daughters, and I was a bridesmaid in a dress I paid for myself. She's fine. She's always been fine. And here's the part that isn't a figure of speech. I believed her. I organized my whole life around it. I took a full ride to a state school because needing tuition was not available to me. I have never once asked my parents for money. Not at 22, not at 26 when my transmission died, not ever. And I used to be proud of that. I thought it was character. Hold on to that. We're coming back for it, and it's going to hurt. November 3rd, 10 in the morning. Gail Prentice, our HR director, called me into the little glass room by the kitchen, the one with the frosted panel that fools nobody, and she had a folder, and her face was doing the thing faces do when somebody has finally read something. She said, "Simone, I want to apologize. This should have gotten to you in August." And she handed me a garnishment order, my name at the top, Simone R. Thatcher. The last 4 of my social printed right there. A case number from the Delaware County Court of Common Pleas, a judgment of $19,860, and a plaintiff I had never heard of in my life. Rowan Asset Recovery, LLC, as assignee of an account ending in 4 digits that meant nothing to me. I read it standing up. Gail was talking. I couldn't hear her. Because here's what I saw, and I saw it in about 2 seconds because this is literally my job. That is not a mistake. A payroll error is a mistake. A garnishment order is the last page of a very long book. Somebody sued. Somebody served. Somebody took a default. Somebody waited out the statutory period, filed for garnishment, mailed a demand notice. Every one of those steps has a date and an address attached to it, and not one of them had ever reached me. Gail said, "Do you want to talk to somebody?" And I said, and this is the part I'd like back, I said, "It's fine. It's identity theft. Somebody got breached." I said it like it was good news. Because at that moment, in my head, it was good news. Do you know how many of these I see in a year? Breaches are weather. Some health system gets popped, 40 million records go up on a forum, and 18 months later a stranger 3 states away opens a card in your name. It's paperwork. It's annoying. It's fixable. You file, you dispute, it comes off. I walked out of that glass room almost relieved. I want you to know that. Relieved. Everybody thinks they got hacked. Nobody thinks it was Thanksgiving. Then I hit my first wall, and the wall was funny in the way things are funny at 3 in the morning. It's also where that rule came from. The one I told you would make you want to put your hand through something. I work at a lender. I have credentials on my desk that let me pull a full credit file on a total stranger in about 11 seconds. That is the entire job, and I am not permitted to pull my own. That's not a technicality. That's compliance, permissible purpose. You may pull a consumer file only in connection with a transaction that consumer initiated. You may not pull yourself, your husband, your neighbor, your sister. People get walked out of buildings for that. It's in the training every single year, and I have personally reported someone for doing it. So the one woman in the state of Ohio best equipped to read her own file was the one woman who legally could not touch it. And that rule doesn't stay at work. It gets into you. You stop looking on your own couch, on your own laptop, on a Sunday, because you've spent a decade learning that looking at your own file is the thing you get walked out of a building for. I built a wall around my own name and put myself on the outside of it. My mother lived inside it, rent-free, for 19 years. I had to do it the way everybody does it, like a civilian, slowly, by mail. And thank God, I mean that with my whole chest, because every single thing I did from that day forward, I did through the front door, and every step left a timestamp inside a system that nobody in my family had ever heard of. November 14th, a Friday, I ordered pad thai and didn't eat it. I sat on my couch with my laptop and did 4 small, cheap, unglamorous things. All 4 took me under an hour. First, I froze my credit. All 3 bureaus. It's free. It's been free under federal law since 2018, and almost nobody bothers. 10 minutes. You make an account, you click, you write down a PIN. That's the whole thing. A freeze doesn't fix anything. It doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't undo $1. All it means is that from that moment on, if somebody walks into a dealership with my name in their mouth, the lender pulls and gets back a wall. Second, I filed at identitytheft.gov. It's the FTC's site. You answer questions for 20 minutes, and at the end, it generates a document called an identity theft report. And that document is a key that unlocks rights you don't otherwise have. It's sworn. There's a box where you certify you're telling the truth under penalty of perjury, and I sat with the cursor over it for a while, because there's a version of you that still thinks maybe you're the one who's wrong. I checked it. November 14th, 7:51 in the evening. Third, I mailed a request for my full file disclosure from each bureau, not the app, not the score, the actual file. Fourth, I mailed block requests. There's a section of the Fair Credit Reporting Act, 605B, that says if you send a bureau an identity theft report and tell them which accounts aren't yours, they have to block those accounts, and they have to notify the companies that reported them. I want to flag that last part because at the time I typed it and did not think about it for 1 second. The bureau has to notify the furnisher, meaning the company, meaning that a letter I dropped in a blue box on a Friday night in November, with my hands shaking, eating no pad thai, was eventually going to land on somebody's desk. Certified all of it. $8 and change apiece, 6 green cards on their way back to me, 4 rows on a spreadsheet. 13 days later, a police officer walked into my mother's dining room. I did not connect those 2 facts. Not that night, not for weeks. Why would I? A freeze is a wall you put up against strangers. That's what it's for. That's what it says on the website. So on Thanksgiving night, I typed things I mailed at the top of a column, and I filled in 4 rows. Freeze, report, disclosure, block, and I stared at the dates. November 14th, November 14th, November 14th, November 14th. Then I opened the confirmation from the Police Records Division for the request I'd filed at 9 that night from my car and looked at the estimated fulfillment, 10 to 15 business days, December 12th maybe? 2.5 weeks in which the only thing I could do was wait on other people's paper. That's not quite true. There was 1 envelope already moving. My file disclosure. Mailed the 14th. The bureaus take about 2 weeks by mail. It came Monday, December 1st. It was thicker than it should have been. I brought it in from the mailbox and put it on the counter and did not open it for 1 hour and 11 minutes. I made dinner. I did dishes I'd already done. I walked past it 4 times because I'd spent 4 months telling everybody it was a breach, and somewhere under my ribs, in the place where you keep the things you're not allowed to say, a thought had gotten in. It got in on my parents' porch, when a police officer asked me who had my social security number and didn't laugh. I opened it standing up at the counter with my coat still on. The first page of a file disclosure is identifying information, and it's the page nobody reads. Name, variations of your name, date of birth, employer, and addresses. I have lived at 4 addresses since I moved out at 18. My file listed 7. And the one at the top, the one flagged as current, reported by 9 separate creditors, going back years, 9 of them, all agreeing, all confident, was 1400 Ashgrove Lane, my mother's dining room, my father's closet. The house I have not slept in since I was 18 years old, sitting at the top of my financial identity like a permanent address, because for the machines that decide who I am, it was. I sat down on the kitchen floor, not dramatically. My legs just quit. That's the moment. If you want the exact second the breach theory died, it's that one. A hacker in another country does not report your parents' address as your address. A hacker does not know what road you learned to ride a bike on. 9 creditors, over 19 years, had been mailing my life to a house on Ashgrove Lane, and 9 creditors had gotten no complaints. I got up off the floor and I turned the page. And then I did the thing I'm good at. God help me, I did my job. A trade line is a line on a credit file that represents one account. It tells you the creditor, the date the account was opened, the high credit, the balance, the payment history, and the status. I read maybe 200 of them a day. I read them the way a nurse reads a chart. Not emotionally, in a sequence, looking for the one thing that doesn't line up with the other things. I had 11 accounts, 2 auto loans, 6 revolving credit cards, 1 personal loan, 1 retail card from a furniture store that closed in 2017, 1 medical account in collections for $1,180 from a hospital I'd never been to. Total balance across all of them, including the charge-offs, including the judgment, $214,000. I want to tell you, I screamed. I didn't. I got a legal pad. I ruled it into columns because that's the only way I know how to look at something that's trying to eat me, and I copied all 11 out by hand. Creditor, date opened, amount, status. Then I sorted by date opened, because that's what you do, and the sort put 1 line at the bottom of my page all by itself. A retail card, store credit, original limit $300, date opened, April 2006. I looked at that year for a while, then I did the math, and then I did it again, out loud, with my finger on the pad like a child, because I was getting a different answer than the one I was willing to have. I was born in June of 1995, April 2006. I was 10 years old. I turned 11 that June. Somebody opened a line of credit in my name when I was in the 5th grade. I sat on my kitchen floor for the 2nd time that night, and this time I stayed down. You want to know the sound of it? It's not grief. Grief has a shape. This was more like the floor of a story dropping out. I have spent my entire life being the daughter who doesn't need anything. Every hard thing I ever did, I did with a private little coin of pride in my pocket that said, "Nobody carried me." I paid my own way. I bought my own everything. I have never taken a dollar from that house. And it turned out I was never the one who didn't need anything. I was the one who was being used to pay. I wasn't frugal. I was drained. I wasn't independent. I was harvested. Every no I ever swallowed, every dress I bought myself, every year of being fine, the whole architecture of who I thought I was got rebuilt in about 4 seconds into something else. Not a woman who needed nothing. A woman who'd been billed. And here's the sentence I could not get out from under, and it's the one I still can't say without my throat closing. When that account was opened, I was in 5th grade. I could not consent. I could not read a contract. I did not know what interest was. There is no version of this where a 10-year-old is complicit. Whatever this was, it wasn't a family dispute. A family dispute has 2 adults in it. I called my mother at 9:40 at night. I want you to understand why. It wasn't a plan. It was the oldest reflex in my body. Something terrible had happened, and I called my mother because 30 years of training is 30 years of training. And there's a part of me, there is still, right now, today, a part of me that wanted her to say something that made it all right. She picked up on the 2nd ring. She sounded delighted. She said, "Simone, honey?" Not one word about Thanksgiving. Not one. A police officer had stood in her dining room 4 days earlier and told her this wasn't about the money, and my mother answered the phone like I'd called to ask about a casserole. I didn't say any of it. I don't know where the discipline came from. Something in me went very quiet and very cold and very, very good at my job. I asked her one question. I asked, "Mom, where's my Social Security card?" And there was a pause, not long, maybe a beat and a half. And she said, "In the safe, where it's safe." Warm, amused, a little chiding like I'd asked where my coat was. I said, "Okay." And I said goodnight, and I hung up, and I put the phone on the counter and stood there with my hand over my mouth. Because there's the tell, and it's not what she said. It's what she didn't ask. Her 30-year-old daughter, 4 days after a police officer walked out of her house, calls at 9:40 at night and asks where her Social Security card is. And my mother did not ask why. She didn't ask why, because she already knew why. And she'd had 4 days to have an answer ready, and the answer was, "It's safe, sweetheart. It's in the safe." My mother had my Social Security card in a box that a police officer had already told her was a problem, and she thought the smart move was to tell me it was still there. I did not sleep that night. I want to say I did something brilliant. I didn't. I lay in the dark and did arithmetic. $214,000, 19 years, 9 creditors mailing paper to Ashgrove Lane, and a police officer reading 4 lines and getting taller. My father called me on Wednesday. I need you to appreciate this. My father has called me on the telephone, unprompted, maybe 6 times in my adult life. He does not call. He gets handed the phone at the end of my mother's calls and says, "Yep," 3 times and hands it back. He called at 4 in the afternoon while I was at my desk. He said, "Simone, I want to clear the air." I went out to the stairwell. I said, "Okay." He said, "That officer misunderstood the situation." I said, "Which part?" He said, and I could hear my mother's grammar in his mouth, like a man reading a card. He said, "This has gotten bigger than it needs to be. Your sister was upset. She spoke out of turn. Nobody's pressing anything." I said, "Dad, I'd like to know what he read." And my father said, "It's a machine, Simone. Machines get things wrong all the time." I said nothing. 8 years of underwriting teaches you exactly one social skill, and that's it. Say nothing, and let the other person keep filling the hole. And into that silence, my father said, "Come for dinner Sunday. We'll straighten it out. And bring the app. Bring the app. Not bring yourself. Not we love you. Not, I'm sorry a police officer put his hand on my daughter's chair. Bring the app." I said I'd think about it. I hung up. I stood in the stairwell with my forehead against the cinder block, and I laughed once, and it came out of me like a cough. They didn't want me. They wanted the phone, which meant they couldn't get at it, which meant, for the first time in my life, I was holding something in that family that could not be taken from me by being told I was overreacting. But it also meant something worse, and I got there on the drive home. If they wanted the log gone, they'd known there was a log. And if they'd known there was a log, they'd known before Thanksgiving, and they'd called the police anyway. Which is not the behavior of people covering up a theft. That's the behavior of people who needed a police officer to write a specific sentence down. Now here's where I want to talk about the key. Because it had been bothering me since the porch, the way a word you can't remember bothers you. My father slid my spare key across a table before an officer asked for anything. And a key means access. A key means opportunity. It's the first thing anybody looks at. Except I had that key on my ring for 6 years. And in October, the second week of October, at his birthday dinner at the Olive Garden on Route 23, with Chelsea there and Trevor there and my mother cutting his chicken, my father asked me for it back. He said it in front of everyone. He said the insurance company had added a rider and they wanted all keys accounted for, and could I get it back to him? And I said sure. And he said, "Don't drive all the way out, just mail it. Just mail it." I want to be very clear about something. My father has never in his life asked me to mail him anything. My father does not know what a rider is. My father let a shoebox sit on a shelf for 15 years. But I did what I do. I mailed it. Certified. I sat at my kitchen table on the 17th of October, and I put my parents' spare key in a bubble mailer, and I filled out the green card by hand, the way I have filled out 400 of them, because if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. $8 and change. And a week later, a little green rectangle came back to me in the mail, and I did what I always do, which is scan it into a folder on my drive and never look at it again. I was standing in my kitchen on the 3rd of December when I remembered it, and I remember I said a word out loud in an empty room. It took me 90 seconds to find it. USPS Certified Mail. Article number. Delivered October 18th, 2025, at 11:02 in the morning to Delaware, Ohio, 43015. Signature W. Thatcher. My father's handwriting. The W with that flat top he does. On a card with a date on it. In my drive, where it had been sitting, quietly, doing nothing, for 6 weeks. 6 weeks. My father asked me for that key 6 weeks before he slid it to a police officer as proof that I'd stolen something. You don't ask for a key 6 weeks early to catch a thief. You ask for a key 6 weeks early because you're building something and you need a piece of it. And the piece has to come from her, willingly. Because if it came from her willingly, nobody can say you took it. I called the non-emergency line the next morning and gave them Novak's report number and asked to add a supplement. They put me through. It took 20 minutes. When he came on, I told him about the birthday dinner and the rider and the mailer, and I said I have the green card, signed, dated, October 18th. Novak was quiet for a second. Then he said something I've thought about probably 100 times since. He said, "Ms. Thatcher, that's the first thing anybody in this has been able to prove." And then, because I had him, I pushed. I said, "Officer, please, what did the log say?" He said, "Request the report." I said, "I did. It's 15 business days." And he said, casually, the way you mentioned the weather, "While you're waiting, your sister gave a statement that a specific amount of cash was taken from that safe. When I asked her the amount, she didn't have one. When I asked her the last time she'd seen it, she didn't have that either." A pause. In Ohio, making a false report to law enforcement is a chargeable offense. I don't know that that's what this is, but I put it in the narrative. I said, "So what happens now?" And he said, "I forwarded it." I said, "To who?" And he said, "Have a good day, ma'am." That night I pulled the docket. Ohio puts its court records online. You type a case number into a county website that looks like it was built in 2009, and you get a list of entries. Not the documents, just the list. Dates and titles, like the spine of a book you're not allowed to open. Rowan Asset Recovery, LLC versus Simone R. Thatcher. Complaint filed, February 11th, 2025. Summons issued by clerk, February 12th. Service perfected, March 12th. Motion for default judgment, May 6th. Judgment entry, June 3rd. Order of garnishment, July 22nd. 6 lines. 4 months of my life. From complaint to a chicken in a checkout line, and I'd know nothing about any of it. I read one of those lines 9 times. Service perfected. Perfected. That's the actual legal word. It means the court is satisfied that the defendant was notified. It means there's a piece of paper in the file that says, she knows. She had her chance. She chose not to come. A default judgment isn't a finding that you owe the money. That's what people don't understand. A default judgment is a finding that you didn't show up. The court doesn't weigh anything. Nobody looks at the contract. You didn't answer, so you lose. And the number they wrote on the complaint becomes true, permanently, and then it gets to come take your paycheck. I had lost a lawsuit I had never heard of in a courthouse 12 miles from my apartment, and the only reason I lost it was that I wasn't there, and the docket wouldn't tell me why. Because the return of a service isn't a docket entry, it's a document. It's in the physical file. And the physical file lives in a room. I took a personal day, Monday, December 8th. The Delaware County Clerk of Courts is a counter and a bank of fluorescent lights, and a smell I can only describe as toner and radiator. You fill out a request slip with a pencil on a chain. Copies are 10 cents a page, and they want exact change, and there's a hand-lettered sign about it that has been there long enough to yellow. A woman named Bev brought me the file. It was about 1/2 an inch thick. She said, "You can look at it right there, hun. Don't take anything out." I want to describe the next 90 seconds honestly because I've spent my life reading files, and I know how they're built, and I turn to the back the way you'd turn to the back of any file, because service documents get filed early and everything stacks on top. And there it was. A green card, stapled to a proof of service page, USPS Form 3811, the same little green rectangle I have filled out 400 times, the same one I'd filled out in October with a key and a bubble mailer. Addressed to Simone R. Thatcher, 1400 Ashgrove Lane. Delivered March 12, 2025. And on the signature line, in blue ballpoint, in handwriting, I have been reading since I was old enough to read, D. Thatcher. My mother signed for it. My mother signed for my lawsuit. And there's a box on that card. 2 boxes, actually, side by side. The mail carrier has you check one, addressee or agent. She checked agent. My mother stood on her own front step on a Wednesday in March with a mail carrier holding a clipboard, and she was asked, in effect, "Are you this person, or do you act for this person?" And she picked up a pen and declared herself the agent of her 30-year-old daughter, who had not lived in that house in 12 years. And she signed her name, and she took the envelope inside, and she put it in a safe. And then she did nothing. for 28 days, while the only window I had to answer that complaint closed. And then for 55 more, while it hardened into a judgment. I stood at that counter and I did not cry. I got two things very clear in my head, and they arrived in this order. 1. I was not in the middle of an investigation. I was at the end of one. It was already over. I'd already lost. 6 months ago, in June, in a courtroom I've driven past 1,000 times, a judge signed a piece of paper that made a debt I'd never heard of into a legal fact about me. And my wages had been going into it since August. I wasn't collecting evidence to prevent something. It had happened. I was standing in the wreckage taking pictures. 2, and this is the one that changed everything. My mother had not just used my name. She had kept me quiet inside a courthouse. Anybody can steal a social security number. It's 9 digits, they're on a card in a box, half the countries have been sold twice. That's opportunistic. That's sad. But to take a summons out of a mail carrier's hand, addressed to your own child, and sign for it as her representative, and then say nothing for 28 days while the window to defend closes, and nothing for 55 more while a default hardens into a judgment, that is not opportunistic. That is a person managing a legal proceeding against her daughter on her daughter's behalf to a conclusion. That takes attention. That takes calendar awareness. That takes knowing what a default is. That takes doing it before. Bev asked if I wanted copies. I said yes. I said all of it. She said it's 10 cents a page, and I gave her a $20 bill and stood there while a machine that was older than me ran 51 pages, and my hands were shaking so badly, she looked at me and asked if I wanted to sit down, and I said no thank you, and she brought me a paper cup of water anyway. That was the second time a stranger was kinder to me than my family had been in a year. I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to actually answer it in the comments before I tell you what happened next, because I've told this story to maybe 5 people, and every single one of them guesses wrong at this exact spot. Why did they call the police on Thanksgiving? Not why did they blame me? I'd been the one they billed since I was 10, apparently. Why then? Why that week? 19 years, 9 creditors, $214,000, and it never once cracked. Not through a wedding, not through a hospital stay, not through 19 Christmases. And then, in the last week of November, my mother led a uniformed police officer into her own dining room and put the whole thing under a light. That's insane. That's the single most self-destructive thing she could possibly have done, unless something had already broken. Unless something had happened days earlier that made a police report the safest option left. Tell me what you think it was. I'll wait. I drove home from that courthouse, and I was different. I want to be precise about how, because it's not what you think. I didn't get angry. Anger was actually the last thing left. What happened was that I stopped trying to be believed. Do you know how much of my life I've spent trying to be believed by those people? Every conversation with my mother for 30 years has been me presenting evidence to a jury that had already voted. And on Route 42 at 4 in the afternoon on the 8th of December, it just turned off. Like a hum you didn't know was there. They were never going to believe me. They had never intended to. It wasn't a misunderstanding I could fix with the right sentence, said the right way with the right face on. So I stopped talking to them entirely. I didn't announce it. I just stopped. And I started building a file, not a case. I want to be careful with that word because I couldn't afford a lawyer. I was $214,000 in the hole on paper and $430 lighter every 2 weeks. I could not afford anything. But I don't need to afford a file. A file is free. A file is what I am. 4 days later, the envelope came. December 12th, Manila, Delaware County Records Division. $8.50 I'd paid at a window. The incident report is 4 pages. The narrative section is a paragraph and a half of cop prose, all caps, no adjectives. Reporting party stated, complainant unable to provide. And then a line that made my ears ring. Attachment A, photograph of electronic lock audit display provided by Thatcher S. Attachment A was the last page. It's a photograph of my own phone screen, taken slightly crooked, with a thumb in the corner of the frame, and the glare of a porch light across the top. 4 lines. User 02. Access denied. 2/11. November 20th, 2025. User 02. Access denied. 2/12. November 20th, 2025. User 02. Open. 2/14. November 20th, 2025. User 02. Close 2:14. November 20th, 2025. I sat down on the arm of my couch. Read it again. Read what it actually says. User 2 is Chelsea. Everybody at that table heard me say so. My mother heard me say so, and something in her face stopped, and I didn't know why for 2 weeks, and now I did. 6 days before my sister told a police officer that I had emptied our father's safe, my sister was inside our father's safe, at 2 a.m, in the dark, in her own parents' house. And she got her code wrong, twice. That's the detail that gutted me, and it took me a minute to understand why. Chelsea got her own code wrong twice, at 2:11 a.m, which means she'd never used it. 6 years that code sat there, and she had never once needed it, because she'd never once had to get anything herself. And then the last 2 lines, open at 02:14, close at 02:14. Same minute. The safe was open for less than 60 seconds. Nobody empties a safe in under a minute. You can't. You have to kneel down. You have to reach in. You have to carry it. If there had been cash in that box, stacks of it, enough to be worth a police report on a holiday, that door is open for 4 minutes, 5, and the log would say so. Under a minute is not a robbery. Under a minute is somebody reaching in, taking one thing out, looking at it, and putting it back. And then, underneath, the thing that isn't there. The negative space. In 4 lines of the last recorded activity on that lock, there is no user 4, because user 4 opened that safe one time in 6 years, on a Sunday in December of 2019, with a screwdriver still in her hand. That's what Officer Nowak read on a porch in 11 degrees. The woman who reported the theft was in the box. The woman she reported wasn't, and the box was open for less than a minute. He didn't stand up because he'd solved a burglary. He stood up because he'd realized he wasn't at a burglary. Ma'am, this isn't about the money. I went and got my spreadsheet, things I mailed, and I scrolled up to the top row and I looked at the date on the freeze. November 14th. And I looked back at the photograph on my coffee table. 20th of November. 6 days. I asked you earlier why they called the police on Thanksgiving. Here's the answer. And I need you to understand that when I got there, I had to put my head between my knees. On the 14th of November, I sat on my couch with cold pad tie and I froze my credit. 10 minutes. A free thing on a website that I did because I couldn't afford a lawyer and it was the only move I had. I thought I was building a wall against a stranger in another state. Every lender in America pulls a file before they lend. That's not a policy, that's the physics of it. So at some point after 7:51 on the evening of the 14th of November, somebody, somewhere, ran my name. And instead of 19 years of somebody else's spending, they got back a wall. And an application died. I know which one now. Trevor told me himself 3 days before the meeting, and he had no idea what he was handing me. A pre-approval got kicked back last month, and nobody would tell him why. My sister and her husband had a house under contract. My mother needed a number, the way she'd needed a number in 2006 and 2009 and 2012 and 2022, and she went to the drawer she'd been going to my whole life. And the drawer was locked. For the first time in 19 years, my mother's machine coughed. Now think about her. Think about what that week was like in that house. Something is wrong with the pipe, and she cannot ask anyone what, because to ask is to say out loud what the pipe is. So she says it's fine. She tells Chelsea it's fine. And on the 20th of November, at 2:11 in the morning, my sister, who has spent 34 years being told everything is fine and has made a religion out of believing it, got out of bed and went to the closet to find out for herself. She got her code wrong twice. She opened the box for under a minute. And what was in that box was not money. It was never money. It was 19 years of envelopes with my name on them. 6 days later, she told a police officer I'd emptied it. Because once you've seen it, there are only 2 stories available. Either your mother has been feeding you your sister for 19 years, and you drive a car that was bought with her, or your sister is a thief who broke into that box and read things she had no right to read. Chelsea didn't call the police to protect our mother. She called the police to protect the story where she didn't know. She needed a police officer to write it down. She needed a report with a number on it that said her sister was the criminal. Because if I was the criminal, then the envelopes were evidence of my crime instead of evidence of hers. And nobody would ever ask what was printed on them. They didn't call the cops to punish me. They called the cops so that a man with a badge would be in the room and would not open that box. And it worked, right up until the thief they invented handed him a phone. I'd like to say I felt triumphant. I didn't. I sat on my floor and I thought, I did this. Not the crime, the detonation. 19 years, and the thing that finally cracked it was 10 free minutes on a Friday night, done by a woman who was only trying to keep a stranger out. I locked one door, just one, and my whole family came apart against it, in the dark, at 2 a.m, trying the handle. But 4 lines wasn't enough. 4 lines was the last 4 events on a lock that had been running for 6 years. I wanted all of it. And I'd wanted it since the 4th of December, since the morning I called Novak about a green card and understood that nobody was ever going to hand me anything I hadn't taken out of a machine myself. I could have it because of a thing that everybody in that house had forgotten, including me. That safe is registered to me, not to my father. To my email address from a Sunday in December of 2019, because my father does not do phones. That night, I went into my email and searched the word I knew would be there, and it was an order confirmation from the 22nd of November 2019, $611.14, and a serial number. Then I wrote to the manufacturer's support address and asked for a full export of the audit trail on my account, and I attached the order confirmation and the serial and a photo of my ID. And then I did the thing my whole family has always mistaken for being fine. I waited. That's it. That's the whole masterstroke. A woman in her pajamas emailing customer service. But I want you to see what that is underneath, because it took me until about the 15th of December to see it myself. My mother's entire method, for 19 years, for $214,000, depended on being the only person who touched the paper. Get to the mailbox first, hold the birth certificates, sign for the summons, put it in the box, close the box. She controlled every piece of paper in my life. And then, on a Sunday in 2019, out of pure guilt about a shoebox, her useless daughter who doesn't need anything bolted a computer to the floor of the closet and gave it an internet connection and put the account in her own name. She had spent 19 years building a room with one door, and I had installed a witness in it for Christmas as a gift. I got the notification on Sunday the 14th at 8:40 at night. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter with a little gray banner from an app I'd opened twice in 6 years. Safe Hub, offline. Somebody had pulled it out of the wall. I stood there and I laughed until I had to put a hand on the counter, because I could see it. I could see my mother, 61 years old, on her knees on my father's closet floor, in the dark, on a Sunday night, yanking a plug out of a socket, feeling clever. The export had landed in my inbox on Friday, 8 days after I asked for it, and 2 days before she got down on that floor. 311 events, December 2019 through the 20th of November, 2025. A CSV file, 12 kilobytes. Everything my family had ever done to me in 12 kilobytes, in a font with no personality at all. I opened it in a spreadsheet, and I did the thing I have done every working day for 8 years. I sorted it. Filter, user 2. 311 events collapsed to 6. 6. In 6 years, my sister used her code twice. 2 nights. That's all. 2 nights, 3 years apart, and both of them in the dark. And one of them was 6 days after I froze my credit. The other one was the 15th of March, 2022. User 02, access denied. 03, 03, user 02, access denied. 03, 04, user 02, access denied. 03, 06, user 02, access denied. 0306, user 02, open. 0307, user 02, close. 0308, 4 failed attempts. 4. Between 3:03 and 3:06 in the morning, my 31-year-old sister stood in our father's closet and got her own code wrong 4 times. Try to picture it. That's not a burglar. A burglar is fast. That's a woman in the dark, in her parents' house, panicking, hitting the same 4 digits over and over with a hand that won't do what she tells it, praying the beeping doesn't wake anybody up. And then a minute later, open, close. I looked at that date until it did something to my stomach. March 15th, 2022. I know where my mother was in March of 2022. I know because I sent flowers. My mother had her gallbladder out at Grady Memorial on the 13th of March, and she was in that hospital until the 16th. And I have a florist's order confirmation in my email, 12th of March, $48, delivery to room 214. My mother was under anesthesia. For 19 years, my mother was the only one who touched the paper. And for 4 days in March of 2022, my mother was in a hospital bed, and something my sister wanted couldn't wait 4 days. So Chelsea did it herself, once, badly, at 3 in the morning, with her mother's system and her mother's code and none of her mother's competence. And that is the entire reason I'm telling you this story instead of paying that judgment for the rest of my life. Because the golden child broke the one rule she'd been raised on, which is, let mom handle it. And a machine my mother didn't understand wrote it down. Now, what was Chelsea doing at 3 in the morning on the 15th of March, 2022? I already knew. I'd known since December 1st. It was line 6 on my own credit file, and I'd copied it out onto a legal pad in my own handwriting. Auto loan, Ridgeline Credit Union, date opened, March 2022, original amount, $31,400. A date opened is a month. A month isn't a fact. A month is a smudge. If I walked into a room and said my sister was in the safe in March, and the loan happened in March, my mother would smile at me the way she has smiled at me for 30 years and say, Simone, honey, March has 31 days in it. I needed the timestamp. And there's a way to get it, and I want everyone listening to write this down because almost nobody knows it exists. Under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, Section 609E, if you're an identity theft victim, you can demand that the company produce the actual records, the application, the transaction documents, for an account opened in your name. You send them your ID, your police report, and a letter. They have 30 days. It's not a favor. It's not a customer service escalation. It's a statute. And it doesn't care whether they like you. Nobody uses it because nobody knows it's there. I mailed mine on the 2nd of December. Certified, obviously. Row 11 on the spreadsheet. On the 5th of December, my phone rang from a number I didn't know, and I let it go, because for 4 months, every unknown number had been a collector. She left a voicemail. Ms. Thatcher, my name is Priya Raman. I'm a fraud investigator with Ridgeline Credit Union. I'd like to talk to you about a block notice we received. I called her back so fast I fumbled the phone. I want to be honest about what I hoped. I hoped for a rescue. I hoped this woman was about to be the cavalry. That's the fantasy, right? You hold on long enough, and somebody with a badge and a database walks in and fixes it. Priya Raman put that fantasy in the ground in about 90 seconds, and I've been grateful ever since. She said, Before we start, I need to be clear about what this is. I'm not your advocate. I can't give you legal advice. There are things I can't tell you, including whether they exist. I said, okay. She said, I'm calling you because on November 14th, you sent a bureau a block request under 605B, and on the 24th, they notified us as the furnisher. That obligates me. Then on the 2nd of December, you sent us a 609E demand. A pause. Papers. 2 letters from you in 3 weeks, Ms. Thatcher. You've been busy. I said, I'm an underwriter. And she said, I know, that's why the letters are clean. I asked her the only question that mattered. I said, Are you here because I called you? And she said, Nobody called me. You mailed me 3 weeks ago. This isn't me helping you. I don't help people. I'm required to investigate what you put in front of me. And the only reason there's anything in front of me is that you did the paperwork before anybody knew you were going to need it. Then she said, Don't send me anything else that isn't a document. Don't call me to talk. If we ever end up in the same room, understand that I'm not on your side. I'm on the file side. I said, That's fine. So am I. There was a pause, and I think, I'll never know, I think Priya Raman almost laughed. The 609E response came on the 16th of December in a flat white envelope with the credit union's logo, and inside was a photocopy of an application I have never seen, never signed, never heard of, for a car I have never sat in. My name, my social security number, my date of birth, my parents' address, an employer I hadn't worked at since 2020, a phone number that wasn't mine. And in the header, because everything digital has one, in 8-point type nobody is ever supposed to read. Application received, March 15th, 2022, 9:14:22. 9:14 in the morning, 6 hours and 6 minutes after the safe closed. 2 days earlier, my mother had texted me. Not called. Texted. She hadn't spoken to me since I asked where my social security card was. Ridgeline Branch on Sunbury Road, Thursday the 18th, 4 o'clock. Your uncles will be there. We'd like to settle this as a family in private before it goes any further. My uncles, Dale and Russ, my father's brothers, men I have seen at 4 funerals and a wedding. Men who have known me since I was born and could not tell you what I do for a living. My mother was importing witnesses, not to watch me be exposed, to watch me be reasonable. Because that's the whole trick of my family, and it always has been. Get somebody official in the room, a police officer, a branch manager, an uncle, somebody whose presence makes the lie into a proceeding. And she picked a bank. Of course she picked a bank. In my mother's head, a bank is a room where a man in a tie tells emotional women to be sensible. Chelsea's auto loan is at Ridgeline. Trevor's a member. She thought she was choosing home field. She chose a building. She chose a building with a fraud department, and cameras in every ceiling, and a records retention schedule, and a woman on the second floor who was already required, by federal statute, whether anybody in my family liked it or not, to investigate a letter I'd mailed before Thanksgiving, and a second one I'd mailed after. I texted back the shortest thing I could. Fine. Trevor called me on the 16th, not to warn me, to beg me not to come. He said, Simone, please, please don't. I said, why? And he said, because she hasn't slept since Thanksgiving. 19 days. She's not... Simone, she's not okay. And then his voice broke, and he said the other thing, the thing he'd come to say and hadn't meant to. He said, the house fell through. The pre-approval got kicked back last month. Nobody will tell me why. And I thought about telling him. I want that on the record. For about 4 seconds, I stood in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, and I thought about telling that man what his wife did at 2 a.m. on the 20th of November, and letting him carry it home. I didn't. I said, I'll see you Thursday, and I hung up. That's the only unkind thing I did in this entire story, and it isn't even unkind. I just didn't tell him something. Nobody had told me anything in 19 years. Then I sat down and printed 3 pages. Not a folder, not a binder. I could have brought 51 pages from the courthouse and a 12-kilobyte spreadsheet and 11 trade lines on a legal pad in my own handwriting. 3 pages. Because I've watched 100 people lose a room by having too much, and I've watched exactly 1 person win a room, ever, and it was a police officer on a porch who read 4 lines. You don't win with volume. You win with the smallest number of facts that cannot be standing in the same room at the same time. Page 1, 6 lines of a log. Page 2, an application header. Page 3, my pay stub. And 1 question. I practiced it in my car, not at my mother. I was never going to ask my mother anything ever again. I was going to ask Uncle Dale to read me a date. Thursday, December 18th, 3:30 in the afternoon. I did not go to the conference room first. I went to the second floor because I had an appointment I'd made the day her text came in. She picked the building. I just got there first. Priya Raman's office is not impressive. It's a desk, 2 chairs, and a window facing a parking lot. She had an affidavit for me. It's the sworn statement that goes with a 605B block. The document where you identify, account by account, which lines in your own life are not yours. She turned it around and put a ballpoint pen on it. She said, read it, all of it. I'm not going to summarize it for you. It took 9 minutes, 11 accounts, listed by creditor and date opened, and beside each one a box, and at the bottom the paragraph about perjury. I got to the last one, the retail card. April 2006. My hand stopped. Priya said, Miss Thatcher. I said, I was 10. And she said, and she didn't say it kindly, she said it the way you'd read a weather report. She said, I know. It's the most common kind there is. It's also the one that goes the longest, because the victim's asleep for the first 18 years of it. I signed it. She took the pen back and she said one more thing before I stood up. She said, do you understand that once this is signed, I can't unsign it, and neither can you? If someone in your family asks you to make this go away tomorrow, you won't be able to. That's not a threat. That's the design. I said, I know, that's why I signed it. At 3:58, I walked into the ground floor conference room, and my whole family was already sitting down. That's how you know it was staged. 7 people don't arrive early by accident. My mother at the head of the table, in the good coat. My father to her left. Chelsea and Trevor together, and Chelsea's face. I want to say she looked guilty, and she didn't. She looked hunted. 21 days without sleep. Uncle Dale and Uncle Russ in their 60s, in their church clothes, sitting the way men sit when they've been told there'll be no yelling. And at the far end, with a legal pad and a lanyard, a woman named Ms. Hobart, the branch manager. My mother had asked the bank to send somebody, to witness that everything was above board. I want you to hold both halves of that in your hands. My mother invited a police officer into her dining room. And when that failed, my mother invited a banker to watch her do it again. That's the whole disease. My family has never been able to tell a lie in private. It doesn't count for them unless somebody official is there to certify it. They kept calling in witnesses. It never once occurred to any of them that witnesses write things down. I sat at the other end of the table with a coat on my lap and 3 pages in a folder, and I said nothing. My mother began. And God, she was good. I want to be fair to her. She was so good. She said, "Thank you all for coming. I know this is uncomfortable." She put her hands flat on the table. "We're not here to punish anybody. We're here because this family had a bad night in November and it's gotten away from us, and I want it to stop before somebody's life gets ruined over a misunderstanding about a box." Uncle Russ nodded. Of course he did. It's a beautiful sentence. She said, "Simone has always been the sensitive one." A little smile. "She's had a hard year. She's had money trouble, which she won't tell anybody about because she's proud, and she gets that from her father." My father looked at the table. She said, "Nobody's calling anybody a thief. Chelsea spoke out of turn and she's sorry. But this is a family matter and it belongs in a family, and I'd like Simone to withdraw the police report, and I'd like all of us to shake hands and go have dinner." And then she looked down the table at me and her eyes were wet, and she said, "Honey, please, whatever you need, we'll figure it out. You just have to ask." That's the sentence. 30 years of never being allowed to need anything, and there it was, offered to me in front of 2 uncles as evidence of her generosity. Uncle Dale turned to me and said gently, like a man doing a good deed, "Simone, what is it you want, sweetheart?" I opened the folder and I took out page 1 and I slid it into the middle of the table. I didn't say a word about it. That's the part nobody tells you. When you finally have it, you don't perform it, you just put it down and let the room look at it. 6 lines, a machine's handwriting. User 02, 303, 304, 306, 306, access denied, access denied, access denied, access denied, and then open at 307, and a date in March of 2022. My mother did not look at it. That's important. She never looked at it once. She said, "Simone, that's not what that is." Dale reached over and turned the page toward himself, and my mother's voice changed, barely, a quarter tone, and she said, "Chelsea has never been in that safe." The room went quiet. I want you to understand exactly what happened, because there was no confession. Nobody screamed. Nobody stood up and admitted anything. It was smaller than that, and it was fatal. I had not said Chelsea's name. I had not said whose code user 2 was. I hadn't said the word code. I hadn't said the word safe. I had put a piece of paper on a table with 6 lines of machine text and 2-digit numbers on it, and my mother, who had not read it, who had not so much as glanced at it, had reached across 4 feet of laminate and defended a specific daughter against an accusation that no one in that room had made. Uncle Dale's head came up, slow. He didn't work anything out. He just heard it, the way you hear a wrong note. And my father closed his eyes. I took out page 2 and I laid it beside page 1. I still didn't read anything out loud. I turned it so Dale could see it, and I said the only thing I said in that room that I'd rehearsed. I said, "Uncle Dale, would you read the date on that one for me? Just the date." And he did. Because when a woman asks you to read something out loud, you read it out loud. He put on his glasses. He found the 8-point line in the header. He said, 15 March 2022, he squinted. 09/14/22. Then he stopped. Because he'd just read a date out loud, and it was still ringing in the air next to a date somebody else had just read out loud. And Dale Thatcher spent 31 years as a shift supervisor at a plant where you sign a log every time you touch a machine. He looked at page 1. He looked at page 2. He said, "That's the same day." Nobody answered him. He said, "That's 6 hours." And Chelsea made a sound, not a word. A sound like somebody had let the air out of her, and Trevor turned and looked at his wife the way you look at a stranger. I took out page 3. It's a pay stub. It is the most boring document in this entire story. 2-column dot matrix font, a company logo in the corner. I put it down in front of Dale and I said, "One more. Read the name at the top." He said, "Simone R. Thatcher." I said, "And the line at the bottom, the one that says other deductions." He said, $430. I said, "Uncle Dale, whose money is that?" And nobody in that room said anything at all. 8 seconds. I counted them, the way I'd counted 4 minutes on a porch. My mother's mouth was open very slightly. My father had both hands under the table. Uncle Russ was looking at my mother, and it was the first time in his life he'd ever looked at her that way, and she felt it. And that's when my mother reached for the paper. She stood halfway out of her chair, and she reached across the table and she took page 2, the application, the one with the timestamp, and she pulled it toward herself and turned it face down. In a bank. In a conference room with a camera in the ceiling. In front of a branch manager she had personally asked to attend. Ms. Hobart put her pen down. She said, "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to put that back on the table." And my mother said, "This is a family matter." And Ms. Hobart, who had sat silently for 9 minutes, taking notes because a member's mother had asked her to witness that everything was above board, said, "I'm going to ask everybody to stay seated, please," and picked up the phone on the credenza and pressed one button. And in the 11 seconds before anyone came, my sister spoke. She didn't look at me. She wasn't asking me. She was looking at the middle of the table, at a sheet of paper turned face down, and she said it so quietly that I don't think Uncle Russ even heard it. She said, "Whose car is it?" Trevor said, "Chelsea." She said it again, "Whose car is it?" And my mother said, "Chelsea, be quiet." Priya Raman came in without knocking. She did not rescue me. I want to be very clear because I know how this sounds, and it wasn't that. She didn't have a folder. She didn't have a speech. She had a lanyard and a pen, and she stood just inside the door with her back to it, and she looked at the table, at 8 people, at 1 page face down, and she read out facts in the tone of a woman reading a parking sign. She said, "My name is Priya Raman. I'm with this institution's fraud department." She said, "On November 24th, this credit union received notice from a consumer reporting agency of a block request filed under Section 605B of the Fair Credit Reporting Act. That notice obligates us to investigate whether 2 accounts on our books were opened as a result of identity theft. That investigation has been open for 24 days. It does not belong to Ms. Thatcher. She cannot withdraw it. She could not withdraw it if she wanted to, and neither can any of you." My mother said, "We'd like to resolve this privately." And Priya said, "I understand. There is no private." Then she said the last part, and it's the one my mother is going to hear for the rest of her life. She said, "There are also reports that a financial institution is required to file in certain circumstances. I'm not permitted to discuss those with anyone in this room. I'm not permitted to tell you what's in one. I'm not permitted to tell you whether one exists." And she looked at my mother, and she waited exactly long enough, including whether one exists. My mother sat down, 61 years old, in the good coat, in the room she chose, in front of the witnesses she invited, and she sat down and put her hands in her lap and did not say one more word. That's what it looks like. It isn't screaming. Nobody admits anything. Nobody ever admits anything. I want to say that to every single person listening who's waiting for the apology, because you're going to wait forever. My mother has never confessed to anything, and she never will. She just reached for a piece of paper in front of a camera. 19 years, $214,000, and it came apart because a woman couldn't stop her own hand. If you're still with me, do something for me. Somewhere in the last 20 minutes, you probably thought about a person in your own family who has been holding your paperwork for safekeeping since you were a kid. Go look. That's it. That's the whole thing I want from you. Not revenge. A freeze takes 10 minutes and it's free, and I didn't know that until I was 30. And if you've got somebody in your life who's been the one who doesn't need anything, tell them out loud that you noticed. That's the entire boundary. Being noticed. My father caught me in the lobby. The uniforms hadn't come yet. It was just the 2 of us by the coat rack under a banner about auto loan rates. He said, "Simone." He'd said it 3 weeks earlier on the phone, reading my mother's words. This was the first time in years it came out of him and belonged to him. I waited, and my father looked at me with real feeling in his face, the most feeling I have ever seen in it. And he said, 19 years is a long time not to notice something. He meant it about me. I understood that immediately. He was asking me how I could have failed to notice, and underneath that, he was asking me to agree that it was partly my fault, because if it was partly my fault, it was a little bit less his. And I stood there and I thought about a man who put envelopes in a box for 19 years and drove to Rite Aid and mowed the lawn and slid a key across a table. I said, "Yes, it is," and I got my coat and I left. Here's where it landed 7 months later. I filed the motion to vacate myself. No lawyer, 26 pages in January, at a window, with exact change. The argument wasn't complicated. A judgment entered against a defendant who was never served is void, and it doesn't matter how long ago it was, because a thing that was never valid can't become valid by aging. My exhibit was a green card with my mother's handwriting on it, and a box checked that said Agent. Rowan Asset Recovery didn't even fight it. Why would they? They bought a bad debt for pennies, and it turned into a crime scene. It was granted on the 9th of April. The judgment is gone. Not paid. Gone like it never was, which legally it never was. The garnishment stopped, and Halverson refunded $7,740, and I want you to know I did not do anything meaningful with it. It's just sitting there. Some of it's still sitting there. All 11 accounts came off my file by May. Blocked under 605B, everyone, because a police report and an affidavit and 11 certified letters beat 19 years. Chelsea gave the car back in February. Voluntary surrender. She drove it to the branch on Sunbury Road herself and left the keys with a teller, and I only know that because it's in a file. 2 officers did come to that branch, by the way. About 4 minutes after I got my coat, I was already on Sunbury Road, and I never saw any of it, and I assumed nobody had said anything, because nobody in my family ever says anything. Uncle Russ stayed, 66 years old, in his church clothes, in a lobby under a banner about auto loan rates, and he gave a statement. He told a stranger with a notebook what he had just watched his brother's wife do to a piece of paper. He has never once contradicted my mother out loud in his life, and he stood there and did it into a form. He's the one who called me in March. First time in my life. He didn't apologize because he doesn't know the shape of that sentence. He said, "I read it wrong for a long while." Then he asked if I needed anything. And I want you to hear what happened next, because it's the only thing in this story I'm actually proud of. I said no, automatically, the way I've said it since I was 10. And then I heard myself, and I sat there in the quiet, and I said, "Actually, yes. There's a couch." He drove out on a Saturday and helped me move a couch. That's the entire repair. It doesn't undo anything, and it isn't supposed to. The county prosecutor's economic crimes unit has it now. The false report referral is Chelsea's. The rest of it is my mother's, and it's going to a grand jury in September. And I'm told the phrase they use is child identity theft, and that there's no statute of limitations problem, because the harm didn't stop in 2006. It stopped on a Friday night in November when a woman on a couch clicked a button for free. I did not sue anybody. People ask me that constantly, and they get angry when I tell them. I could have. There's money in it. I've seen the numbers. I didn't want it. I did exactly one thing my mother cannot survive. I didn't take it back. That's it. That's my whole revenge. She asked me, in a conference room in front of 2 uncles, to withdraw the police report. And here's what I never got to tell her, because I have not spoken to her since. I couldn't. It was never mine. Chelsea called them. Chelsea gave the statement. Chelsea put my name in a stranger's notebook. And that's the thing nobody tells you about calling the police on your own daughter. You don't get to uncall them. All I ever did was add a supplement to the back of a report somebody else opened and sign an affidavit on the 2nd floor of a bank. I didn't take those back either. It stayed open, and everything that has happened since has happened because a document exists. 19 years of my life, which lived in a box in a closet where only she could reach it, is now in a public file with a number on it. Anybody can request it. It costs $8.50. She spent 19 years making sure the paper only went one way. I don't speak to any of them. That's not a wound. It's an address change. I pulled my credit report on the 2nd of July, standing in a parking lot, on my phone, because I can look at my own file now whenever I want, and I scrolled down to the section called Potentially Negative Items. It said none, just the word. 4 letters, a little gray line under it, the most boring word in the English language. And I stood in a parking lot outside a Kroger at 6 in the evening and cried like an idiot with my keys in my hand, because for 19 years, there had been an entire second version of me living in a database, running up debt in the 5th grade, buying cars I never sat in, losing lawsuits I was never told about. And she was gone. The blank space is the whole prize. Nobody warns you about that. Freedom isn't a settlement check. It's a screen with nothing on it. I'm going to tell you one more thing, and then I'm going to stop, because it happened 9 days ago, and I don't have an ending for it yet. Priya Raman called me at 9:04 at night. She's never called me at night. She has called me 11 times in 7 months, and every one of them was between 9 and 5 because she is not my friend and she has never once pretended to be. I said, Priya? And she said, Simone. And then nothing for a second, which is not something she does. And she said, Are there any other children in your family? I said, What? She said, I need you to answer the question, not the family, children. And I said, My sisters, she has 3, 9, 6, and 3. The line was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Does your mother keep their documents? And I sat down on the floor of my own apartment in my own coat, 31 years old, because I already knew the answer. I've known it my whole life. She kept mine. She kept Chelsea's. She keeps everybody's for safekeeping in a box in a closet, and every single person in that family has spent their entire life being grateful for it. I said, Priya, what did you find? And she said, I'm not permitted to tell you that. A pause. But I'm going to ask you a second question, and I'd like you to think about it before Thursday. She said, You can freeze a miner's credit. It's free, and it's 10 minutes, and it works exactly the way yours did. And then she told me the part I've been sitting with for 9 days. She said, But a child can't request it. Only the parent can. It has to be signed by the mother. So sometime this week, I have to call the sister who told a police officer I was a thief, and I have to ask her for a signature. 3 of them, before Thursday. And the oldest one is 9.